Not yet. Oh, there's going to be a grand entrance, I believe. So I'll hand over to him. He's orchestrated it all. He knows what's going to happen.
Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's 50 years since I first came across Fred. So I didn't know much about what Fred did before that. Other than knowing, as you all know, that he's a famous photographer of main line railways and London transport, etc. So we thought we'd start with something, a passion of Fred's from when he was a schoolboy. Because this is something which I think I asked Fred, and I don't think any of you in here know anything whatsoever about. So we thought we'd have a go. So here we go.
When we got to Croydon Airport, there was the airport building, of course, which is still there to this day. You went in, it was quite a small booking hall, and there were the booking counters, which always had magnificent models of current aircraft. We would then presumably climb stairs and finish on the control tower roof. That was the public viewing area. You could look down on the aircraft being loaded. The passengers would just go up sort of gangplanks onto the aircraft. So I started to take quite an interest in aircraft. This sort of preceded the railway interest. But what I well remember was the Paris planes loading right in front of us. There was GAA-XD, which was a de Havilland 42, called Pericles, I think it was, and then there was GAA-XD, which was Horatius. They were the two which we saw regularly on the Paris run, loading on a Sunday. Sometimes it was the short aircraft, which were two, Scylla and Shrinks. They were the two which we saw regularly loading. I've got a feeling I have seen a Lufthansa loading. I remember the airlines, which was KLM and Sabina. I remember the DC-2 as a type. Now I don't know what knowledge I had as a result of going to Croydon Airport and then, what should we say, getting information about the aircraft and not necessarily having seen them. I think I have seen a DC-2. I think I have seen a Sabina. But what I particularly remember was the HP 42s and the short, because they were big four propeller planes, and again there was a series of cigarette cards at the time and showing these aircraft in flight and the internal arrangements of all the people in their luxurious saloons enjoying their luncheon on the way to Paris. I remember being in the garden at Streatham one day and one went over right quite low and I looked at it and I thought, it's Hano. And another thing I remember from the garden at Streatham was Caledonia, a C-class flying boat, which flew over London. And that was the only time I ever saw a C-class flying boat. But I knew all about them. I used to cut the cuttings out of the newspaper and keep them. And I knew all the class, I knew all their names and I knew all their registrations. And I used to keep quite an interest in them. And the first one was Canopus, which I always called it Canopus, other people called it Canopus. But that was GADHL. Caledonia, which was the second one, was GADHM. And that was the one I saw fly over the garden at Streatham one day. Oh, we used to do tours of the hangars. This was another thing that used to happen of a Sunday. We'd do tours of the hangars. And on one occasion there'd been the Lufthansa had crashed on the perimeter of the airport and demolished some houses, I think. And when we went round the hangars, totally different to what would happen today, we were shown the remains of one of the engines sitting there.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Can we say a big hello, Fred, to the man himself?
Good evening, or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good start, isn't it? Right. Yes, well, good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Just testing listening to see if you can all hear me.
Can we all hear Fred?
Yes.
That's what I want to know. Lovely, thank you folks. Well, that was Fred's initial passion, aircraft, because I'm sure that Fred was aware of other forms of transport even when he was a youngster. Were you not, Fred?
Yes. My early days were, I started life in Streatham in South London, but during the course of the first 10 years, for various family reasons, or lack of family reasons, I spent lots of time in various parts of South London. And probably my interest in transport was initiated in South Norwood, where we had, as a daily event in the high road there, passing of Southmet trams, 2-axle trams, open tops. And I was aware, even at that age, that there were two different types. There were the Crystal Palace cars and there were the Penge cars, and they were different. We also had the Tilling buses, Thomas Tilling buses, open top and solid type on Route 75. I also started school in South Norwood at the age of 5, which would have been in 1931. Whilst we were in South Norwood, they withdrew the trams from Penge and replaced them with they replaced them with the existing Thomas Tilling buses on Route 75. And of course, as you all know, Route 75 still works through South Norwood and down to Penge. And to this day, although it's only reinstated fairly recently, it is worked by a Thomas Tilling bus garage, Catford. I then moved to Stockwell, quite close to where Stockwell Garage is today, and then on to Balham. And in Balham, which we see there, I went to live with a family, which was a very mixed family. The elder lady, who really was my guardian, she was an invalid. And then there were two brothers. One was a labourer and the other was a civil servant, if you can work that out. I became the shopping agent for the family. I spent as much time shopping, I think, as I spent at school. And part of my shopping took me up and down Balham High Road, that spot probably twice a day, where there was a Sainsbury's, and there still is. There were two Sainsbury's in Balham at the time. There's now one, but it's enormous. And part of what I would have seen would have been Class E1 trams that used to see there passing along Balham High Road. Obviously I didn't take the photograph, but it was acquired by a friend of mine, Dennis Battens, who many of you may know. It is showing you an E1 in its original condition, although in 1926 they had internal refurbishment. But other than that, it's more or less as it started life. Although the Clapham cars had been upmotored, and so it has got upmotored and equipment. You will see a picture later on showing one at a later stage in their lives. But that car, for a number, is 1627, and of course, many of you know, one in refurbished guise operates at Crich, which is 1622. So it's quite close. There were a detailed difference with the earlier Hurst Nelson cars and the brush cars, but perhaps that's too minor to mention. Well, if anybody wants to know, I'll tell you afterwards. That's about it. Nick?
Okay, Fred. So, Fred was a youngster, as you know, just at the start of the war, and young children in London were evacuated to the safety of the countryside. And I believe that happened to you, did it not, Fred?
It did happen to me, yes. It did happen to me. My father was one of these people. He was an optimist, a super optimist. There'd never be a war, so don't bother. All the newspapers said, go to schools, arrange for evacuation. He said, don't bother, there won't be a war. So I spent August 39, mainly on Clapham Junction Station. But elsewhere they were preparing for war. And then my father said, I think there might be a war. You'd better go to the school. When I got to the school, where have you been? Well, I'd been warned of the question. So I was told the answer would be, if they mentioned it, we didn't know about the evacuation, and if they then said, well, you were told, I was prompted to say, we don't read newspapers and we don't listen to the radio. And that finished up in the Streatham News. One pupil, they didn't read newspapers and didn't read the radio. So, as a result, I was included after all. And on the, I suppose it was the 2nd or 1st of September 39, we were all assembled on Streatham Station, on the down platform. Whenever I go to Streatham Station, I relive that experience. We were bundled onto a train, and of course it was compartment suburban stock. Nothing special. We all thought to the coast, but no way were we going to the coast. And so we boarded this suburban train, which probably earlier on had taken a load of business people, we didn't call them commuters in those days, to London Bridge. And we made our way. We passed Streatham Junction and headed down through Sutton. And somewhere in the Cheam area, people were asking questions of the master. There was a master or teacher in each compartment to keep order. And somebody said, "Sir, where are we going?" And he was sworn to secrecy. He said, "Oh, I don't know." And then somebody said, "Are we going to Eastbourne, sir?" And I chipped up and said, "Not on this line, we're not." And got a black look from sir. Anyway, eventually landed at Horsham, so I was disappointed because as far as I'm concerned, we're still in a suburban area, because that was the extent of the Southern Railway suburban area. There I saw my first 042 D1 type tank, and we were then on the Southdown bus and finished up at a place called Southwater, which is not too far from Horsham. It's very famous for it, or it was at the time, for its brickworks. They turned out millions of bricks, and recently on an LCC housing estate in South London, a wall had collapsed and I found a brick with Southwater on it, so I photographed it. Photograph anything. So there we were in the village hall, which overlooked Southwater Station, which was fatal for my education. Not that there was much education. And the highest numbered the engine on the Southern Railway at the time in the main capital stock was a D1 loco numbered 2699. It wasn't a 2700. And one day I looked forward to see that I wasn't being looked at by anybody, and I then got up and looked quickly out of a window because I knew what was going on outside, and there was 2699 going by with a small train to Horsham. That was wonderful, but after a month my father came down to visit me, and I didn't really like being down there, and I managed to convince him that I wanted to come home, so I returned to London in early October. But then, of course, it is, in fact, this was the postcard which he sent to me actually on the 17th of September, because he was had been in his time a city person and used to sort of take the train to London Bridge. And during the early 1940, there wasn't any school, although I was of school age, there wasn't any school, so I did what you would call these days work experience at his firm in the Borough High Street. And I used to then be one of the people who travelled from Streatham to London Bridge each day. So it was a station I knew quite well. It was like that. Unfortunately, Hitler put paid to what it looked like that about a year later. One disturbing experience I had that
My father worked at the firm and he was not there for some reason. I was, but he wasn't. And they gave me his wages to take home. When I got home, I ain't got any wages. And then they arrived by post from somebody who picked them up, that one who had turned deserves another. And we never knew who it was. An anonymous person sent me because there was a address on it. So that was good. But that was London Bridge Station as it was in those days. Well, in actual fact, that was taken before those days, because it's obviously 1930s picture. A nice box, as we called them, LT on the 17. They were known as Bluebirds in later years, and other buses which are very recognisable. And what we bear in mind that although London Bridge Station in the background was virtually destroyed, the bus station remained for many years with buses standing as you see them there, but with the various rebuildings of London Bridge, eventually the buses all face the other way, and they still do to this day. But my father sent me that card, and his message is on the reverse. I was called Eric in those days because my name, Frederick, was, for some reason, they forgot to put the K on. So I've got the continental way of pronouncing, of spelling Frederick. I was, of course, in those days, if you were a schoolboy, you were master, and you can see where I lived. That doesn't take a lot of seeing. The Southwater near, and you notice the affection. Thought you'd like a PC of the older station, and that was it. Note the penny stamp.
Yeah. So, after a month in the country, Fred comes back to London. This is the early part of the war. What did you find in London when you got back?
When I got back to London, everything was as I'd left it. Nothing happened. It was a phony war, as they called it. It was happening elsewhere. It wasn't happening in London. It was all perfectly quiet, and I spent most of the time on my local common watching the Southern Railway. They did get us back to some form of school around about the spring of '39, but it was all a total waste of time, and I think my education benefited from watching the trains on Tooting-Beck Common more than anything they could come up in the old school, which was one class of all ages in one classroom. You can imagine what that was. But then it all changed, and I was also doing trips to Clapham Junction at the time, and meeting my old friends, which I'd met originally in 1938, when my father took me to Clapham Junction. I met these old friends who met on a piece of land which is known as the Green, just south of Clapham Junction. It's where the two lines diverge, the Southwestern and the Brighton lines. I met these old friends, and we were having a good old chinwag and watching the trains go by on the 15th of August. And the 7:15 train went down, which was unusual work. It was a very daily working, but it was an H tank. All of you who know what H tanks are, 044 tank, the Bluebell has one. Had 3 coaches, which were bird cage. The Bluebell has bird cage coaches. And on the back was a milk tank. And as it passed by, lo and behold, the air raid siren sounded. It was a bit of a shock. And everybody scuttled to go home, but I was now a long way from home. And a friend of mine, a chap called Frank Davis, who had a very distinguished career later on with London Transport, he decided to go home. And I remember saying to him, well, don't leave me, will you? Because they were all older than me, but they scuttled. He said, that's all right, shelter down there. And under the pub there was a shelter, and the last I saw of him was boarding the bus like a future bus inspector getting on. It was an LT on the 37, so I always remember it well. And I sat down there amongst those strangers, and suddenly somebody said, all clear's gone, and you can go. So we went, and I expected to see Clapham Junction destroyed, and in fact it was still there. And I made my way down to Harding and Hobbs, and an SDL came along quite normally on the 49, and I got home. When I got home, nobody seemed the slightest concerned that I'd been out in an airlift. But moving on, at that same house on 19th of October, a bomb fell right behind us and blew the windows and the ceilings out, and the conservatory disappeared into thin air. because it was quite a large house we lived in, and I might add it's still there to this day. But my father thought, well, we'd better leave. I believe it was convenient because my father had taken a mortgage out on the house, and meant we didn't have to pay it back, I believe. Anyway, we duly moved, and we went to above a shop which had belonged originally, it belonged to a Mr. Balls. And Mr. Balls was a hire car proprietor, but he had previously operated buses for London Transport. And he was a friend of my father, so we took a flat above his premises, which were to the left of this picture. 11th of January 41, after having a day out with my father, in which case we went to the Elephant Castle. I saw all sorts of interesting trams and buses, and I'm writing all the details down in green and red ink according to the colour of the vehicles I'd seen. And all of a sudden there was a big whistling sound, and the next thing there was a crash, and the bomb had fallen just outside. Well, 3 bombs I'm told, I think it was probably 2. One fell at the side of the building in Streatham Place, and if you go to Streatham Place today on the left, the bomb site is still there. It's never been built on. Opposite was Brixton Hill Tram Depot, which is behind that tram. This is Christchurch Road to the right, and this is Pullman Court, which is still there. But a bomb fell in your imagination there, and it went bang in the middle of the tram track. The tram tracks were like hairpins standing upright, an enormous blaze from a burning gas main, and I'm told some of the tram track finished up in the Crown and Sceptre pub roof, which is behind us here. But my father, being a very calm sort of person, he said, I think we'd better leave, and so we left. My aunt, who was my guardian, took all her possessions in a basket. What I do remember, and I'm making this up as I go, was the fact that when the bomb actually fell, and I was doing all this writing, my father threw himself over me, and a great lump of ceiling fell in his chair. If he hadn't thought of me first, he would have been killed. No doubt about that. And anyway, we finished up the Crown and Sceptre. We were entertained by somebody who was telling us all about, he was an air raid warden, telling us all about how incendiary bombs worked, I remember that, and how you should put them out. In the meantime, they managed to put the fire out, and the all clear went. But the outcome was of that they had a big hole to repair, which took months to do, and they had to organise 2 tracks into one, single line working. Light railways with a token. That's obviously not my picture, but that was a picture taken by an enthusiast at the time. 2 inspectors, and one of them's giving the token to the driver of the Felton tram. It's in wartime guise, as you can see, with white fender, and originally passengers could alight at both ends, but they discontinued that some years later, and so the trams took the single line. When they got to Telford Avenue, they retained double line, and another car would come through towards London, and that's how it was. Of course, really, we should have been in that shelter you see to the right of the, but my father sort of said, oh, we don't take shelter. No bombs will fall on us. Well, we nearly did, and we got away with it. Anyway, that's about all on that.
And the fire raids, Fred?
Yes.
No, fire
Well,
raids
yes. So of
were
course, I should
As
point
this
out
picture
that
shows.
what then
Background.
happened was, can we go back? Is
Yeah.
it possible? What then happened was we couldn't live here anymore. It's quite obvious. So we moved up Christchurch Road, which is the road to the right, and the air raids petered out. This was the 11th of January 41. It tended to peter out, but then there were 2 what they call Baker raids, where Hitler was retaliating for our bombing their cities, and he bombed cities which like Bath and that, but he had 2 retaliatory raids on London. One was the 16th of April, a very, very bad air raid. But the worst one was the 11th of January 1941, and that was the air raid when Croydon Garage was burnt out. Next day, we left home, and Brixton had caught it very, very badly. And there were still bits of the burning paper and debris floating around, well away from Brixton where we lived. But this was the outcome of the raid on Brixton, taken many years later, well, several years later. There was a big department store called Quinn and Axton's, which is on the corner of Brixton Road, the main Brixton Road shopping centre, and Stockwell Road, which is that way. But believe it or not, the main structure survived, and that building is still there today. Not called Quinn and Axton's anymore, but it's still there, and they restored it more or less to its original tile work and all that. And it's still recognisable to me to this day. But of course the trams are still running. There was a very interesting route, 34, which made its way from Kings Road, Chelsea, although at this time it was Battersea Bridge because a barge had clobbered Battersea Bridge and the trams couldn't go over there anymore. And then it made its way through Clapham Junction and Clapham and Stockwell, down through Brixton, Camberwell to Blackfriars. The interesting thing about that tram route was that it went off the conduit here. It was just on overhead pole wire from here through to Camberwell, quite a short distance through Loughborough Junction. And this is the change bit, as you can just see there. You can see the conduit slot leaving from the middle of the road, the track, going onto the island. And there is a fork which the plough attendant, would use to guide the plough back underneath the car. And that's just being used because he's just going back on the conduit. Now at Acton Museum Depot, we have a reconstructed piece of conduit track, or the actual, not the track, but the actual conduit slot. It was at Clapham Tram Depot, where as a motor training school, it was at Covent Garden Museum. It got dismantled, but one day I complained to one of the curators the fact we hadn't got it anymore, and I couldn't explain it to people anymore, and he said, I'll reconstruct it. And he reconstructed it, great credit to him. But what's part of the reconstruction is that we still have a fork. You see the fork in the right hand side? We have one of those forks at the Acton Museum Depot. But that's Quinn and Axton's, and it's a rehabilitated E1 tram car. Rather than what you saw earlier, it's one that had a heavy rebuild at Charlton Works, one of about 250. It was intended to do 800, but in the end they only did about 250. And from those old cars like you saw earlier, they put flash panels in lower decks both ways, they put built-in indicators rather than external indicators, and so on. So they were known as rehabilitated cars. Rehabs for short. But a friend of mine who was very knowledgeable, and I mention him later, he reckoned that Charlton Works actually regarded them as reconditioned cars. But there on the 10 is another rehab making its way from Tooting Broadway through to Southwark Bridge.
Thank you, Fred. So the time comes, we're still in the war, the time comes when Fred has to do his bit for Queen and Country. And so Fred now has another episode to tell you about. Where did you go to, Fred?
I was called up to they had a scheme at the time called the Bevin scheme, Ernie Bevin, the Minister of Transport, I think he was. He devised the fact they really needed miners more than soldiers at that time to have a Bevin Boy scheme. We still put Bevin Boys. I think that name came later. I think that was what the press named us as. I don't think we were officially known as that. Whatever we were known as, I finished up by getting a warrant to attend Paddington Station and catch a train right in the middle of all the because by this time we were having pilotless the aircraft known as flying bombs or doodlebugs coming over, so you never quite knew what was going to happen next. But I made way to Paddington Station, caught a train that was probably going through to Fishguard, got off at Newport, and I was on the way to a place called Oakdale. What I remember about Newport was that having left the main line, went to the branch line platform. Although I expect my train had a pannier tank on and a coach, there was another train on the platform going to the LMS line, which was the old LNWR, and it could have been 1920s, even earlier. It's an old LNWR 062 tank, complete with probably an LNWR coach. But anyway, made my way up to Oakdale. That's where we did our training. I was there for probably a fortnight, perhaps 3 weeks, and we were shown about how to do things underground and the safety of walking underground, except that I nearly didn't listen and nearly came a cropper. But I'll tell you that in a minute. But there was a famous railway viaduct there, which was an all-metal viaduct. It was very, very high, and if you looked at a train going over it from the ground, it was just like a tiny little miniature going over, crumbling viaduct. The greatest act of vandalism in the area was when they ripped it down. It should have been kept. And the noise it made when the train was going over was unbelievable. All that hot metal, hollow metal. But that was the colliery, taken, we think, probably from the crumbling viaduct. The only incident of really, we were housed in hostels, miners' hostels, but the only real thing was that collieries have an airway system whereby shafts have fans that suck air up, and their system of workings, and the air automatically goes down another shaft and circulates around the various headings. And but they have doors down below which are supposed to be kept closed, and you only pull them open when you've got to go through, and you never ever put your back against one because it will blow you over. Fortunately, there is a space underneath which is has what they call a piece of bratish cloth. And one day I was the tail end Charlie, as I always was. I didn't like going with the rest, always trying to get back. And I forgot and sort of let the door close behind me and got blown over. And the Pistol Party kept walking, but they rescued me, so that was all right. And but that was at Oakdale. But then I was moved on to do the serious business at a place called Llanbraddock, which is one town north of Caerphilly. There was a colliery with 3 shafts, 2 steam coal, 1 house coal. Steam coal was the lowest, dusty, noisy, hot, and pretty awful to work in. They were upcast shafts, in as much that the air was used down there after it was no longer fresh when it was down there. It was being drawn back up. The one that was the best one to work in was what they called house coal. It was the shallowest down. It had all the fresh air because it was downcast shaft, but it was very, very wet. But it was also very, very safe because the roof tended not to fall in the house coal. We tended to fall in all the time in the steam coal. So I finished up in the house coal, which was home from home really. I quite enjoyed it. Well, I didn't enjoy it, but I put up with it. But this has all been told.
Yeah. We've got, can I say, we have an hour-long programme of Fred recounting his experiences down in South Wales on YouTube. I'll make sure that the link gets communicated to the friends on the website, etc. It is fascinating. I think Fred had great respect for the miners and the society in which he found himself, which was completely different to what he'd been used to in South London. And so it is a fascinating hour listening to Fred talking about.
We'll just briefly, we got the time to briefly mention where we go now.
You can move on.
Oh, well, we need to move on. Sorry. Okay. So that's where it is, but Barry's told you how to link it up.
Now during that time, something happened, and Fred got
Yes, what happened was,
suggested that you should photograph trains, not just look at them. Go on. Tell us how that came about.
that came about because one of the other Bevin boys, although he was a man of 25 actually, he had also was a booking clerk, because I had taken up, which we haven't mentioned, I'd taken up employment in 1944 with London Transport as a junior booking clerk, temporary. But I then met this 25-year-old man who had been a booking clerk at Staines on the Southern Railway, and he was an enthusiast, and we got to know each other. The only difference was, whereas I used to just shovel coal, because he had had a very good education, he used to go around and do all the measuring. But we still got on well together, and I changed experience, and one day said, you should really take up photography. So I borrowed my father's camera, and we went to Seven Tunnel Junction shed. Not sure whether we asked if we could go round or whether there was nobody there anyway, but all the engines were completely dead, nothing in steam, and he said, well, here you are, got all these engines, which one are you going to photograph? So I naturally photographed the oldest one I could find, which was a Dean's Goods 22414. Now most of these Dean's Goods had been sold to the army, and they were in France, all over Europe, but just a handful were still being kept for the Great Western Railway. And there you are, there is this Dean's Goods, and you can see it is Seven Tunnel Junction. As you look just to the left of the buffer, you'll see STJ. But I've often looked at this and thought, early photograph, he didn't teach me anything whatever about telegraph poles sticking out. Move on. But then, later on, we progressed with this photography, and I had a friend, a great friend, and at the time, Peter Melville. I'd met him at Euston on one occasion in 1942 or 3, when he stepped off the footplate of a train from Blackpool. There was a driver, Mac, at Blackpool, who would always give a lift to any enthusiast, in the middle of the war, of course, any enthusiast who wanted a lift back, and he had a lift back on the footplate at Blackpool Loco, and as he stepped off the footplate, somehow I got to know him, and we became very firm friends, and I knew him for many, many years. But he was a good photographer in his day, and he said you should get that picture published, and it was at Old Oak Common, a brand new 9400 pannier tank, GWR. Only the early ones actually carried that livery. By the time you got to 9466, which is the one we all know because it's involved in this various steam activities on the Met in these days, it's dressed as that livery, but it was never in that livery really. It was always in VR livery because it was built much later on than that. It got published in the Railway Correspondence and Travel Society, Railway Observer, for September 1947, and if you can see it, it's the middle picture. That was the first picture that was ever published of mine, 1947, all thanks to Peter. Well, I had no initiative on my behalf, whatever. Carry on.
So Fred is relieved from being demobbed from being a Bevin Boy, returns to London Transport. It's 1948, and he now faces his first 2 weeks of annual leave from LT, and to end up in Scotland.
Excuse me, I should have turned that off. That's telling about some train movement, I know what it is. So, yes, I returned to, although I'd been taken on temporary, it seems they were desperately short of staff after the war, so they took me back. And I finished up, I remember, at the Lambeth North. No, I didn't go to Lambeth North Training School. They took me straight back at Victoria, and I was told, well, Gavin, on the window, you've only been away 3.5 years. You know what to do, don't you? Yes, I do. And so we carried on. But then annual leave came up, yes, 1948. And I was with some friends, one of them who had joined the railway as well. He was younger than me, and he joined as a junior clerk at Wilston Locomotive Shed. And so we all had our annual free passes, because you could get one annual free pass a year if you worked for the Underground. I think this free pass I had, and the free passes we all had, were clipped more times than you could imagine, and probably they were used to cover more mileage than any other free pass had ever been. But we did it, and it was fine. So we went to Scotland, of course, and one of our visits to Scotland took us to Waverley, Edinburgh, Waverley. Now, I was into black and white photography, but with still an old camera, not a laser camera, and the negatives, some of them were printed at the time, but most of them had never been printed, and the prints have been lost anyway. And what Barry did last week, he took all these negatives and he scanned them all. So Barry here scanned all these 1948 negatives, and this is one of the results. 2 station pilot engines at Edinburgh Waverley, standing waiting to shunt trains in or out of the platform, because in those days it was all steam trains. As you can see, the early typed colour light signalling and the shunt banner, and there you are. Other parts of Scotland, I looked to see if I could find the classes of these locos this morning, but again, I've got so much stuff at home that the stuff I want I can't find. And this is an old like Scottish 440, they all had names, painted on, believe it or not. But it was still LNER at the time. We hadn't got to nationalisation. Yes, we had. We were just into nationalisation, because this is 48. And we were just into nationalisation, but much of the stock still had LNER on, or nothing on, or whatever that has. We got as far as north as Inverness, so we didn't do too badly on our free passes. And I believe this is a train with an old Midland 440 compound, still LMS note, leaving Inverness station. Many years later, that was 2 days ago, I left by train from Inverness station. Not in Scotland, somewhere on the old LNWR railway, an old LNWR 080, mates have all worked in their time, they could hoard anything, although Sir William A. Stanier had introduced a large class of 280 locomotive, but at the time there weren't enough to replace all these, and so wonderful sites like that wonderful loco could still be seen. And it's still in its old LMS number of 8897, LMS on the tender, and there is one of those engines preserved, fortunately.
Thank you, Fred. Oh, right, so back to London. Here we are. The pre-war plan to replace the trams with trolleybuses have been revised after the war, and we're into trams being replaced with motorbuses. How did you come to be, you've so far been photographing railways, and now I think you've changed your allegiance to the fast disappearing tram?
On my return to London in November 47, we were given demog numbers. So if you were in the services, you got a demog number. Mine was 62, and although we were really totally unwanted in the mines, that's my personal view, we were kept there until I had demog, and that was only fair. But my 28th of November 47, down to Cardiff on the first Great Western train back to Paddington, and goodbye South Wales forever. That's what I thought at the time. And within no time I was back up the Green. I mentioned the Green earlier. There were now additional friends to meet. They were younger than me, and one of them was a chap called Bob Chipperfield. Bob was extremely passionately interested in the trams of London, and one of the first things he said to me was, "Come down to Wandsworth Depot," he said, "after we finish here. They've got some old trams stored in there." "Oh, have they?" said I. "And well, must see those." So we go down Wandsworth Depot. Everybody was free and easy in those days. Come have a look round the airlock itself, and there were all these old trams still in their withdrawn condition. Might have done some work early in the war, some of them did. They were emergency reserve cars, but by this time they hadn't run for years. And so there were, but it reignited this interest in the trams. And so I started to look at the trams, and one of the trams that was to see at the time was something like you saw in Balham High Road earlier on, except it's been fitted with higher dash plate. It's also got its headlight covered, because they're now using the headlight as a small headlight, but also a tail light, which when the trams were unscreened they didn't use. And of course it has the driver's screen, and most of the trams, well all the trams this time have driver screens. In the early days of the war, some of the early trams in the Poplar area were unscreened, and but on the south side they were all screened. And I was told by a friend of mine that the drivers at New Cross were not happy when suddenly they had some unscreened cars to drive again, even though it was the middle of the war. Anyway, there you are, so I could go back a minute, sorry. That is mint condition, ex-Charlton works. Look at the trucks, painted black, no dust or anything on them. It's got the new indication about how to describe the car rather than class E1, it's E1 and a number, Metropolitan Stage carriage plate. But above all, it still retains, could you point the advert panels? Still retains all the advertising frames, which many of the cars this time, after they've been through works, they've been done away with and they just had flush panelling. That is a mint condition. This is what Charlton Works did to their trams in the days after the war. On Southwark Bridge, which had been heavily bombed, and it's a cut-back terminus, because just beyond there's a temporary bridge and the trams couldn't go over it. And the original terminus was way down on the junction with, I think, Cannon Street. I then, through John Bob Chipperfield, he said, I've met a chap at New Cross. He knows all about the trams, he remembers them back to LCC days, he knows everything about trams, you must meet him. So I met this chap. His name was John Wills, and if anything, any knowledge I have on trams is all down to John Wills. He knew everything about trams. He educated me on the controllers, the motors, the types of, well, I knew the types of trams. But we meet outside New Cross Depot, and all the trams would go by, because New Cross Gate was where two lines had come in at the Marquis, and two lines went back out towards London at New Cross Gate, one up to the city by Old Kent Road, the other by Peckham. So it was a constant stream of trams along here in service. But just to enliven the proceedings, you got the cars coming back from Charlton Works, going back to their depots. And here is 1944 on its way, mint condition, back to Holloway Depot. Now, interestingly, because most of these E3s had lost their advert framings, but two had kept it, and this was one of them, 1944. As you can see, all indicators blank, but it's via Kingsway subway, because that was fitted to all the cars that would have run through the Kingsway subway. So that's a great picture to me, 1944, still in original condition. Many of them had damaged screens, and they'd put wooden screens on, or had war damage, but that car was still undamaged in any way, just more or less as it was built. Although I believe when they started they actually didn't have screens. Another car that featured at that time was this car, number 1312. Now this had been a Poplar car, and it had been withdrawn with the Poplar changeovers and put into store in case it was required. It may have run as an open-ender in the Blitz time as a temporary replacement, but then because they lost a lot of cars in the early air raids, they reinstated a lot of the old Poplar cars, remotored them, retrucked them and re-equipped them. And this was a re-equipped old Poplar car but with Clapham type equipment. But what they didn't do is they didn't put the high dashes on to match the screens. They just filled in between the top of the dash and the lower part of the screen with a piece of leather Rexine we always, it was called Rexine, and we always called it Rexine, but it was a sort of leatherette, but it was very flexible, and a lot of the trams running had those Rexine screens. That car was I think the only car, well, it was one of the few cars at Clapham which was a reinstated car from North London, East London, but because it had been fitted with some equipment probably of a more damaged Clapham car, 1800s they were, the 1922 it runs, it ran from Clapham, but it came to a rather unfortunate end. Now one morning, a friend of mine, Dennis Battens, who I've mentioned already, he lived in Balham, I lived in Streatham, so I went over and met him, and I was at work at 7 o'clock, but we went off 8 o'clock, but we decided we'd photograph night cars because there was a stage 1 heading close to us. And what went by on the 2 and 4, but this one, 1312, well it never ran the 2 and 4 because they only had a single pole. And it always ran on routes that didn't need pole changing. But of course the 2 and 4 down at beyond Tooting had an overhead section to Wimbledon. So I never used it on the 2 and 4, but this morning it turned up on the 2 and 4. So I couldn't photograph it, got to go to work. It would be all right. I think we normally laid on the floor and took time exposures. We didn't have to do it with this one because it'd be out all day. So later on in the day, after I finished work, cycling through Balham, I noted the running number, and there was this running number on a tram number 1777, with no indicator number whatever. Oh, I smelled a rat there. It's been replaced. Worse still, evening news, tram fire in Balham that morning. I went to Clapham Depot, there it was. Poor old 1312 came to a fiery end. And what next to it is a fiery ended Felton tram, which came to a sticky end at Brixton Hill Depot not long afterwards, when they had a fire in Brixton Hill. Fortunately the staff got all the other trams out and only 2 Feltons were not burnt, but there's a sequel because they had been sold to Leeds. Leeds couldn't have them, burned out. So they took number 1 in exchange. And now number 1's at Christ's being rebuilt. Wouldn't exist if that fire hadn't happened. Well, Route 12, Wandsworth Route, figured in stage 1 of the tramway abandonment, but also Route 12 had figured in the pre-war tramway abandonment, inasmuch as it used to be a very long route that ran from the borough right through to Mitcham and so on through Tooting, but they cut the route in half. And the northern bit remained, as we see, but the southern part became a trolleybus route, number 612. And for a small part of the route they overlapped. And there's a 612 running through to, well it's going through to, I think he's got the wrong line up actually, I think he's going actually to Mitcham, but got Battersea up, and the route was via Tooting, Battersea, Prince's Head to Mitcham Fair Green. They used these D3s on there, they were D3 trolleybuses, still got the original wire grille, many trolleybuses this time had a more modern grille. Yeah, another feature is it's still got the original running numbers. About this time they were fitting bus, because the bus department had taken over and it had become Central Road Services, and so they were fitting bus type stencils to the side of the vehicles, and some of the trolley buses at Wandsworth actually had the bus type stencils, and they still use the originals and put them in the cab window. And they were never used at Wandsworth. WD never showed up on a trolley bus. They used those stencils they used those plates to the end, enamel plate with a white number or blue plate, and so there is the 612, which was, but that figured as to be withdrawn. Along with tram route 12, the 612 was withdrawn, and they created the original facility of a through bus route, and they numbered it number 44, and there's still a bus route 44 to this day.
Thank you, Fred. Well, the trams have gone, short lift 612, trolley bus has gone, so where do we go next?
We go next to the fact that the same Bob Chipperfield great friend in his day, turned to trolley buses. I didn't, but he did. But then I met him one day and he said, trolley buses haven't got long to go now, you know. I said, no, I suppose they haven't. And he had this interest and I then shared his interest. Then one day, history repeated itself. I've met a chap at Holloway who knows all about the trolley buses at Holloway. He knows every trolley bus by the adverts on the front of the trolley bus. He knows them all. Well, that's pretty good. But he's 15 years old, so I thought, well, better beat him. But Bob's insisted, so I think he was 15 or 16. Bob insisted, and I sort of did it. Met this young lad. His name was Tony Belton. And as a result of that meeting, we got to know each other well. We spent a lot of time looking at trolley buses together. And as a result of that meeting, trolley bus preservation took a great advance some years later, and trolley bus 260 was preserved, which was entirely his initiative. Although I supported him financially, because it wouldn't have happened without my financial support, it was his initiative. And all those trolley buses you see at Carlton Coldwell today stem back to Tony's initiative. Now, so I met Tony. But anyway, he was also a mine of information. I think he was quite young, and told me one day that there'd been some floods in South London, and the 654 trolley bus route had been deprived of some of its short type trolley buses, which were fitted with special brakes for managing the steep hill at Annerley Hill, and they'd had to borrow some longer trolley buses, class J3 from Holloway, to meet the shortfall while they repaired the Sutton's own native trolley buses. So here was J3 completely out of its area at West Croydon on the 654 going to the Crystal Palace. This only happened for probably a few days, perhaps a week, fortnight, I'm not sure now, and I believe it was 1958. But that Station Road, West Croydon, it's just overtaken 630, which terminates there, which is interesting itself because it's a F1 trolley bus, which were normally natives of Hanwell. But having said that, they used to sometimes loan them out to other depots, and Hammersmith had that one at the time.
Well, quite by coincidence, I didn't know Fred was going to produce these negatives. And about 2 weeks beforehand,
Sorry, could we go
Sorry.
back?
Sorry.
Another thing to
I was
say.
go-
Could I go back?
2 weeks beforehand, I ended up in the same position. There's still electric traction there. But that was just a...
I would just mention something else, is the advert on the front of the trolley bus. They were only short of advertisers for the fronts of trolley buses either side of the indicator. They have got a brick flick on the F1, but this one, they did these rosettes. These, we were told, and Tony told me this because he knew all the staff at Holloway, they were known as stock bills. But this was two rosettes, and one was male rosette on a male head and the other's a female head, and they faced as they did. Well, I just one day happened to say, call them the backward twins, and they were known as the backward twins from then on. I think that's all. Well, these J3s soon went back to Holloway and finished their days in their proper location, Route 611, going up and down Highgate Hill, Dick Whittington and all that sort of thing. Right, sorry about that. You can show your picture.
No.
Well, yeah, do that again.
That happened.
Could you do that again? Just to show you the same location, all these years later, a few weeks ago, electric traction has returned to Croydon. The buildings are still just decaying a bit more than they were 50 years ago, but pretty grotty place now, and I don't suppose it'll be long before the developers look at it and think, oh, and that will be good. But that's it for the time being. Right, carry on.
But now Fred's hooked onto trolley buses. What are you doing on top of this trolley bus, Fred?
Well, it comes back to Tony Belton and the preservation of 260. Around that trolley bus, we formed a group called the London Trolley Bus Group, which became the London Trolley Bus Preservation Society. We absorbed into our group one great personality, Ken Blacker. I'm sure you've all heard of Ken Blacker. He is the ultimate knowledge of trolley buses and has written many books on the subject. He came into our group and advised us on preservation and all that sort of thing. And we finished up by getting several trolley buses. And one we took under our wing, not ours, one we took under our wing, and it's back to Wandsworth Garage, but well, it's a garage now, where they stored vehicles, was on behalf, it was Brighton 6342. It was one of the company vehicles at Brighton Hove and District. It had been kept on behalf of the British Transport Commission Museum, who were going to be at Clapham. It was stored in there with a load of old buses. 1966 is the year, and we went down to collect it. It was covered in dust. Now it became my role, whenever 260 went out, to wash it down. And we won prizes and goodness knows what else with it. So it became my forte to clean 6342 down. I think Tony did some of the work on the lower deck as well, to be fair. But I went up and had this gantry, which was very useful. Got some lovely pictures of RTLs taken from the roof. You know, I didn't waste time. I did everything. So we cleaned it down and it went on its travels. I'm not quite sure I think we took it down to Kent to start with, but it eventually finished up at Carlton Colville. The sequence was that about 20 years later we decided we hadn't got any room for it because we kept acquiring trolley buses. So we asked the Science Museum to take it back. We had a heck of a job at the Science Museum, they didn't know they owned it. Eventually they discovered they did, and eventually took it back, and it's down at Broughton near Swindon in their store now. Okay.
So, 1962, we've lost one of the trolley buses, but that summer, I think you find yourself back in Scotland again.
Oh yes. Dennis Battens, once again, was always a little ahead of me. He took up cinefilm before I did. He took up colour before I did, but only just. And he bought some film which fitted the old 620 camera, large format, colour. And on the last day of trolley buses at Stamford Hill, we all went to Stamford Hill that morning, and we shared a film between us in his camera, and I got them home, large format pictures of trolley buses on that last Sunday at Stamford Hill. There is an amusing story about Stamford Hill, but perhaps it makes a bit sensitive, so I better not tell it. I'll tell it to some people of you later. We then went to Scotland the next day, and a certain person, Mr. Hugh Taylor, who I'm sure many of you know, can never understand how I went to Scotland when there was a changeover of trolley buses the following week. But we went to Scotland, and we went round Perth locomotive. And all the engines, instead of being filthy like they were in 1948, they were spotlessly clean. And I thought, oh, if only we had a colour camera. So we decided to go out and buy a camera between us, which was 35mm. But it had an awful viewfinder. It was a piece of plain glass, I always reckon. I've still got it rusting right home. And not the viewfinder, but the camera. And one of the first pictures I did, of course, I lost the roof of the dome of the bus. But it's still an interesting bus. It's one of the wartime London utilities. It was a Northern Counties body, and they had got quite a number of these Alexanders at Perth. And there's another one. And the one you saw earlier was, well, this one is G291. The one in front, Northern Counties body. The one behind it is a Park Royal body, which was G198 in London. So there they are in Perth. But, there is a but, because we went round the garage at Perth, and we very friendly until we got to the fitting shop, the dock. The chap there was quite friendly until he got to the point, you people from London set all your rubbish up to us. Well, you can understand why, can't you? Made a nice job of them having said that. Altered the indicators a bit, and there are other detailed alterations. But that was Perth. And then, of course, the RTLs had started to go away from London. They were already not only selling guys and things like that. The guys had been gone about 10 years then, but the RTLs and the RTs were now going to London over-ordered, and then had reduced services after the 1958 bus strike. So there's an RTL with McLennan's of Perth, I'm not sure what the number is, I'm sure most of you can work it out. But it's still what it's moved this time. And
It's worked it out.
yeah, I'm sure some.
54.
Thank you, excellent, well done. Well, that impressed me. But also in Dundee, there were some Craven RTs which had been got rid of, because they were the unpopular ones because they were totally unstandard. And if anybody can dispute it, but I do believe that's RT 1419 in Dundee. The interesting thing is, when the previous visit to Dundee, about 10 years earlier or less, the trams were running in Dundee, and there's a tram track still in situ. Boots in the background, lovely boots, all real traditional shop. A lovely city and lovely clock. And there were the RTs. The indicators, pathetic in comparison to London.
And then 25 years later, you're back in Scotland again.
Yeah, for more refugee numbers. By this time, London was getting rid of its route masters, but fortunately, they weren't all going to scrapyard, they were going to new owners. And I think the manager of Clydeside at the time was a bus enthusiast. I think it was Mr. Watson. And he acquired a large number and ran them on services all around Glasgow, Clydeside, and he painted them in that red and yellow livery. Now I believe he was inspired by Shoplinker, because London had red and yellow buses on a Shoplinker service some years beforehand. But the interesting thing is, I spent from the Saturday before last to last Saturday travelling on a bus in Scotland in that livery, RM835, which had started life as RM248, and it's owned by friends Steve Fennell and Ray Rittmeester, and with 17 other people we went all round the islands and Highlands of Scotland on that bus last week. Not that bus, but RM835, a similar one, but with a much earlier body than that. There's another Clydeside. It had finished up as RM416, and Magic Bus, which was an arm of Stagecoach at the time. They were operating in conjunction, in competition with with Glasgow Corporation, I suppose. And this was an early Stagecoach Magic Bus livery. And there's two vehicles there in Scotland, and this all happened in the 1980s. Another one in Scotland was Kelvin Scottish, and there's RM1010, and they all kept the original, well they didn't, but the others kept the original London numbers. They didn't, the new numbers. And there is the one in that livery, and last week I saw a Kelvin Scottish bus, not a route master of course, but it was in that livery.
Now, Fred spent the first half of his long career on the Underground as a booking clerk, going located at various stations, and wait a minute.
That's
I missed that one.
that's in
Sorry,
Perth.
I'm jumping.
That's Strathtyre, Perth. Anyway,
We're going to move on. Various stations, one of which was Park Royal.
that's
So
right.
what happened at Park Royal?
Park Royal, they all knew of my interest, of course. And one day the station inspector, Dan his name was, I was working in the booking office. I might add the booking office is still there. It's a listed building, listed booking office, very small booking office. And he said, there's a steam train coming from Acton, Fred. We can spare you in the booking office a couple of minutes, you want a photograph. So it shows you how busy it was. It wasn't. And so I got L44, which you all know is nowadays Met number 1, putting some brake vans on its way back probably to Ruislip. Look at the old tombstone in sign, and in the back and to the other side of that, the station garden, which incorporated Bullseye sign. But on that left of that hut on the westbound is still there to this day. Right. Another feature of that time was the introduction of A-Stock onto the Met. This was in February 1961. I'd heard it was coming. It was the very first unit coming from Acton Works through to the Eastern Depot. That's taken a bridge just north of Ruislip, right a minute, just north of West Harrow. So that is an A stock on its first minutes on the Met. Those minutes were to last 50 years.
And then 2 years later, we're getting ready for the centenary of the Metropolitan.
I think it was actually centenary of the Underground. I believe, although we all thought of it as Steve, it was 100 years of the Underground. I believe it was
that's
that. And they did a lot of preparation. Now, by this time I was a depot clerk, they called it at Neasden, and I had to prepare Tayman's timesheets and do anything that was clerical to do with trainmen. Interesting because I was always advised never to put in for the job, and I did so, and the union man came to me and said, "You've got the job you want at Neasden." I said, "Oh, that's good. I didn't think I'd get that." He said, "Yes, you were the only applicant." So that didn't forebode well. Anyway, I met a wonderful character, a station master. I think they were running inspectors at the time. We all got regraded later on. And his name was Jack Corrie, absolute gentleman. And on Sunday afternoons, because I was only doing clerical work, he would say, "Want to have a wander around the depot?" So around the depot, all this was happening. There was Loco 1, John Lyon, the surviving dreadnought, all the rest was scrapped, which was all going to feature in this parade next one. And then weeks later it was painted, and there it is on another visit with Jack round the depot, 38 stock, and one of the new A stocks in the background, right? Then the office was on the northbound Met platform, an old Metropolitan shack, which consisted of the office, trainman's mess room, which I was advised never to go into, and, the mess room never to go into, and the running office. But I was in the station master's office, yard master's office, that was his other title. So it was in 3 sections. One day we were approaching these events, and we were borrowing from Bluebell. Chesham stock had been sold to the Bluebell Railway, 4 coaches 2 years previously. 1 coach is here, and 1 coach was scrapped. So they borrowed the Chesham stock back from the Bluebell. Bluebell had done some funny painting on it, which it didn't leave with, but it was hauled from New Cross Gate by L46. Somebody said to me, "It's coming from New Cross Gate, it will be here in a minute." So I looked at the camera, 1 exposure left, 1. So I went to the office door, got the office door open, in the background, new A stock, and that's the only picture I got at L48 with the Chesham stock. But it is historic. It's on its way from New Cross Gate back to Neasden Depot, where it had come from originally. The poor old loco looks as though it's had to work hard. There's steam coming out from underneath the smoke box door. Always a bad sign with an engine when you saw that. But it's steaming well, and so there you are. But I never got any more pictures.
But we've got that picture to show.
So another visit to the depot, saw the stock in there, plus the milk van. The milk van had been a milk van with the Metropolitan. It had been converted into a tool van for the breakdown train, but this event converted back into a milk van. And of course that milk van, as you see it there, resides in Acton Museum Depot to this day. Another part of the event was to have a ceremony at Moorgate Station to celebrate the 100 years of the opening of the railway between Paddington and Moorgate. And they had the LT singers, I think it was, or players, whatever, performing in wagons which had S&K on, which were the original contractors. And the whole thing had to go to Moorgate. The exhibition end loco was going to be L44, which was all duffed up beautifully for the occasion, but the train had to be taken to Moorgate. I'm in the office that morning, doing my clerical work. Station master is in the middle, looking out the window, or whatever he did. And the other depot clerk is the other side. Suddenly the door opens behind us. "Oh, Gav, this train that's going to Moorgate, steam train," he said, "somebody reckons we provide the guard." "Oh," says the station master, "I don't know." And he said, "Well, we don't know anything about it." Well, I had done a little bit of private, unofficial research, and I knew that we did provide the guard. So I thought, I've got to be brave here amongst all these dignitaries. That I did, and I said, excuse me, but I do believe if you read this circular, we do provide the guard. Oh! The thing is, poor guard, tallest guard we had, was pulled out the mess room, sent up the steam, and there he is riding on the back. And I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't done my research. Train probably got cancelled. That would have brought the pains on at Broadway. Anyway, the morning arrives. I've got a feeling, we've got the days mixed up here, I've got a feeling that event happened the day after this, but this is the actual ceremony day, and the trains were all lined up on what they call the beaches and brought into the head shunts, shunting necks, but these are the first trains away. That's train 1, train 2, to go in the parade, so they were in the shunting neck. I went on to the North Circular Road Bridge. I was working, but I assured everybody that the trainman's pay sheets would be completed at the end of the day, even if I had to work at midnight. They believed me, and that was done. And so I got all sorts of unofficial breaks during the day. And on this break, I went to North Circular Road Bridge and got a brand new, probably never carried passengers A-stop train, which was conveying all the dignitaries, whoever they were, into an Eastern Depot. It's just taken the points from the Bakerloo line, northbound, to take them into the depot. Train 154, some lady, I haven't a clue, maybe the chairman's wife, is having a wave to me. And it's special, of course. But there's the T-stock, and there's the Loco 1 and the Dreadnoughts. Right. Part of the, this was 15th in the because it was the final train in the procession, and it was Loco 1, which had been heavily rebuilt. It had survived by a mere miracle. It had survived as L45 and had been done up 2 years beforehand to Loco 23, and it's now here. And but it couldn't steam. If you put any steam in that, it'd blow up, I think. So it was pushed around by a brand new A-stock and a match wagon, and that was 15th in the parade. So that was the great day, and I've got all the traffic circulars relating to it and everything. I've got all that, and so has the museum.
And then
there's all there is on that.
Yeah, and then your career moves on.
Oh yes, I was encouraged while I was a depot clerk, being with the nobility, to become part of the so-called nobility and put in to become a relief clerk, which then would take me to station master. So I put in for it and managed to pass out as relief clerk. Well, a relief clerk meant that you worked in booking offices, but you had a uniform, and if they really ran out of station masters and relief station masters, and so desperately short, they'd take a relief clerk to be a station master. It never happened to me, because what happened was the chap who took my place at Neasden was a union representative and was rarely there, so as a relief clerk I covered my own job for about 18 months. So that was brilliant, but eventually the day of reckoning came and I was appointed as a station master. Started off at Bank for a few weeks and then to Oxford Circus, and the rate of movement was so great at the time. Then to Northfields, where I took on train running. Well, I'm used to running a depot, but running Northfields was high-speed running. I just about kept up with it. I don't think they really liked me at Northfields, but it doesn't really matter. I had to learn the signal cabin at Northfields, and one of the things I signalled one night, under supervision of course, was an old 38 stock car which was destined for the Isle of Wight. But then they found me a nice middle turn job out of the way. Couldn't have put me further out of the way than Uxbridge. And there I had 4 wonderful years as a senior station master at Uxbridge. Eventually it became senior station manager, all while I was there. Originally it was senior with a small s and had become with a large S. That indicator was there and the clock was there and the station hasn't changed a great deal. But I took a great pride in my station. It was my station, and it had my name up in the booking office, Mr. F.W. Ivey, station master. Never photographed it, idiot. And after 4 years, a nomination form came round, and I decided to put in as a relief senior station manager. What I didn't know was that they'd abolished the grade, and although I got the job, I finished up doing all the donkey work like any other relief station manager would. And I finished up doing all sorts, well, I won't go into that just yet, it comes later. But this was a feature of Uxbridge, was the first train out indicator, which they photographed a few weeks ago by Barry. It's still there. What Barry has pointed out, something I would not have tolerated, was that I'd have had the publicity department straight down after that, and but that in my day we wouldn't have had that. And what I did achieve was, in my last year there, I achieved the best station in the area award, and went up to 55 and shook hands with Sir Richard Way and was given a certificate. The inconvenient thing about that was it was the last day of the double deck operation between Charing Cross and Dartford. So having got my prize, I lodged it with the station inspector at Strand, and then went off to Dartford and back, and then retrieved my prize and took it with great pride back to Uxbridge the following morning. Oh yes, one thing I had to learn Northfield's box. I wasn't too successful with that. I wasn't really that good with signalling at all, but Uxbridge had a box, and they had a similar lever arrangement as this, what they call a Class L miniature lever frame. But I learned that. It was quite easy to do the trains coming in and out the terminus. You just followed a certain sequence. A bit more complicated putting trains into the sidings or taking them out. And I had a wonderful signalman to train me, wonderful signalman. And the great day came, or evening came, when the area manager was going to pass me out. So the area manager sat down, and I can't think of his name, the signalman sat down, and they sat side by side, and a train came in to go into the yard. And suddenly I thought, I don't know what to do. Oh, I don't know what to do. Signalman shuffled his feet, and then I knew what to do. And then afterwards I apologised to the area manager for the error. It wasn't an error, I did the right thing, just too long doing it. And he said, I didn't notice anything, and signed sheet. I'm now taking I was at Oxford for 4 years. And many, many years later, they installed an L-frame at Kingscote on the Bluebell Railway. It's only actually been commissioned this year to work the line through Kingscote up to East Grinstead. And on my birthday, 90 that day, I was invited into Kingscote signal box, invited under strict supervision to operate the passage of the next train through. So there I am, and doing what all good signalmen do when they pull levers, check where your train is on the diagram.
And the year you became station master at Uxbridge was also the year you
Yes, that was the
went off to Europe with your
yes. A great friend, and many of you may remember John Barry, one of the great tramway enthusiasts of his day, helped to form the Light Railway Transport League Data Association. He insisted that I ought to go abroad. There were trams abroad, you know. Well, up to then we'd had more or less trams in this country, so plenty to do, trolley buses and you name it. But he encouraged me, and we went on a trip all around Europe, which he organised, to be fair. And one of the places we went to was Vienna. And that's Vienna. That's a small works car in Vienna. That's a side street in Vienna. And
similar to a side street.
Then that's in Innsbruck, where they had trolley buses and trams. And that's on the railway, I think it's out into the Austrian Tyrol. And I can't remember the name of the tramway, but it was a fantastic tramway, and these great big motor cars hauled around the trailers.
It's still working.
Still working. That's in Zurich in Switzerland. And this I've always considered myself not to be a fine weather enthusiast, and I think this proves the point. In the height of a blizzard in Liège in Belgium, just arrived on the car, nipped out, get a quick photo. Was the only passenger, there was a bit of arriving, and no doubt the only passenger going back. Old John was probably with me as well. He might be on the car. I don't think he was foolish enough to get off. Anyway, and then in Ghent, while we were in Ghent, there was a little pile-up between a couple of vehicles that delayed the tram service, and that was the outcome. And I noticed the track gauge in Liège, which was very much like the old Bristol was in Liège. By this time, the Bristol was still there at this time, and I did a couple of photographs of Bristol cars. I think that's ended these stills.
Thank you, Fred. You went on photographing for a long time after that. And then Fred gets to the point where I think the year you were facing retirement and perhaps a change in life.
What happened was, in that year, that a friend of mine who many of you may know, Bob Greenaway, another great person of the past, I've used cinefilm for many, many years, as well as still photography. And he encouraged me to take up video. With his help, I bought a high 8 video camera, which I used for about 10 years before going into mini DVD. So, as far as colour slides are concerned, I carried on until only 2 years ago, when I then changed to digital still photography. But this transition is cinefilm into video, which Barry copied all these videos some years ago and has put excerpts of them onto YouTube. So from now on, that's what you're going to see.
We finished where Fred said he bought a video camera. Videos are funny old format. He bought a high 8 camera. Anybody remember high 8? It was better than VHS, I'll give you that. When many years later he came to me and said, I want it all on DVD, I then discovered the problems with high 8 videotapes. Without getting too technical, basically they designed it with a control track right down the edge of the tape. Just the slightest piece of damage to a tape and you lost your sync, you lost your colour. Just some of these pictures, I mean most of it's fine, but some of it is not quite, there are imperfections. That's not Fred's fault. That's the designer of the high 8 video system. Some Japanese gentleman in Sony. So that part, most of this is Fred's early video work from the 90s. So I thought, you don't want to see modern stuff, so I'm sure you all wanted to see how it was. It's amazing how, even in 25 years, how things have changed. So, without further ado, we press the right button.
so the train can be taken down in steady stages back to Mount Pleasant Station again. And hopefully we don't see the train for another 4,000 miles. It doesn't develop a fault during that time, and it'll come up here to be serviced, to be sent down again. And they do this continuously to a train that's travelled 100,000 miles, which is probably nearly 10 years, 8 to 10 years, maybe slightly less perhaps, and the train will have a major up. Well, as I mentioned before, this is the only system in the world which has this automatic railway system. The Japanese have a similar problem in Tokyo, of course. They're suffering with congestion there. They're nearly saturated with vehicles, and they've been given 3 occasions to have a look at.
my day, you've got wooden board. Yeah, I know board sort of thing. Yeah. In there, you've got speed control governor, which is 2 glass balls. In relation to monkeys, no. Right? 2 balls, centrifugal. Main reason for a lift going too fast will be the cable snaps or something like that, so they wouldn't want to stop.
we're drawing to a close, ladies and gentlemen. One correction to what I said earlier, or at least addition to what I said earlier. The event this coming weekend at Epping Ongar actually spans Friday, Saturday and Sunday. So if you really want a busy weekend this coming weekend, you can go to Epping Ongar on Friday, you can go to Twickenham on Saturday and decide what you're going to do with the Sunday as well. Right, just to wrap up, and I'm conscious just watching those videos that it's amazing how things can change quickly within a span much shorter than Fred's 90 years. I mean, I wonder whether when he was taking that photograph of trains at Vauxhall, he was obviously aware that the double-headed steam train was quite historic, but not probably that the Eurostar behind him was going to be historic as well within a few years. It is a brave chairman that, having had a fairly long session of an hour and a half, then allows his audience to go for tea in the expectation that they're going to come back for round two afterwards. I think it's actually a tribute to the interest in what Fred and Barry have put together, that whereas we did lose a few, that's inevitable. The great majority of the audience came back for stage two after the tea, so that's a testimony, I think, to the interest in what you've seen. So, two thanks on your behalf. One to Barry Coward here. I think for 1 or 2 conversations over tea, there may have been some confusion as we share the same first name as to which Barry it was that put all the films together. It wasn't me. It was this Barry on my left and your right. Although obviously the star of the show has been Fred, of which more in a second. Barry, although he didn't have the lion's share of the speaking part in the actual presentation, and that was the intention, obviously. Behind the scenes, Barry has actually crafted what you've seen today, talked Fred through what could be covered, what couldn't be covered, and particularly provided all the technical backup to make it all happen, and the pictures link up with the words. So you did it spontaneously, but do it again because I think Barry deserves it. And finally, to Fred. What can I say? I think we've only grazed the surface of recollections and photographs covering 90 years. But what a life Fred continues to lead. We thank him particularly on behalf of those organisations that he volunteers with still, very actively, very enthusiastically. As I said in the introduction, the Museum Friends here, Epping Ongar Railway and Bluebell Railway. But I think we also owe a debt of thanks just for the fact that he has recorded what he has recorded, both recorded in the sense of taking it into his memory and sharing those memories still very clearly with us, but also in the tremendous photographic archive that he's built up in all the years that he's gradually progressed through the various stages of photography, from black and white to digital and to video. So thanks for all of that, Fred. I think we're all amazed at how active you still are. We're sure you're going to be active for many years to come. We congratulate you on reaching the landmark of 90, but we look forward to further things still to come in the years ahead. So a great round of applause.